Okay. Okay. So let's. This is a sugya that starts in medias res. It's not written in any way as a commentary on the Mishnah and Temurah. It just happens to mention the Mishnah and Temurah, and right, and that's so it's put in here. Uh, one of the um, one of the real issues in um, understanding it is that it makes basically no reference to any other sugya, even though it deals with a topic that clearly relates to many other sugya. Right? It seems to exist in splendid isolation from every other conversation. Nathan, I'm putting the document I'm working off in the chat again. Right? So it's hard to understand. So it's easy to give a conceptual share because all you have to do is just figure out like the sugya makes claims that are obviously not, obviously too broad to be true. And so trying to figure out, right, how to get the sugya to make conceptual sense so they can be saying something reasonable is a major challenge. And that's what all the articles in Shurim are built around, even the academic articles, right? They have to try and figure out, okay, so what does this do with, let's say, how does this relate to mitzvah ba'avera? How does it relate to chatei b'shvil shetiske, which people really haven't, I think, that, or even more than that, how does it relate to shlo yehechote niskar? Which I think is really the closest connection, which I haven't actually seen brought in sufficiently by other people. So those are one of the things, if those are the things that the Sugya presents because of the problem is that it's in isolation. One of the things that we have discussed in the rest of the share is to what extent Rashi would allow it to preserve that isolation, and to what extent Rashi is in saying no, you can't read it that way, even though his commentary doesn't always bring in all the connections he does. So we're going to do a little bit of that, but for our purposes, at least today. Right, right. We're going to try and treat the sugya with Rashi in isolation. Right, we're not going to raise any issues that Rashi doesn't raise. Um, Structurally, the sugya follows a pattern which I don't know enough. I don't know enough to know how widespread it is, and specifically about Rav and Abaye sugya. I suspect quite widespread, but I haven't done all the Rav and Abaye sugya systematically. But the one that I do know easily offhand is the Yesh Lamidat sugya, and this is structurally in some ways identical. In the sense that it begins with a very, very broad conceptual claim. Yesh lo midas havi yesh lo yesh. You have right kol milson amid rachmana lo savidi avid mahani lo mahani. And at the end, it finds grave difficulty, right, allowing for there to be machlokus in any case. Right. Now, the reason for that, pretty straightforwardly, is that a machloket Abaye Rava is an Amoraic machloket, and therefore has to, right, it only has two choices. Either each side has to be able to account for all the evidence, all the Tanaitic evidence preceding, and if it's a big conceptual issue, there's going to be a lot of there's going to be a lot of stuff preceding. Or else it has to align itself with the prior machloket time, in which case, who cares? Right? So that's a fundamental, right? So anytime you present there being a fundamental machloket among the Amoraim, and you have no explanation for why the issue would be new, right? You're gonna be presented with this issue that they have to account for a long chain of precedents. Right? And this you can watch this, in Supreme Court jurisprudence as well often, right? Sometimes you can figure out, why it is that this issue is coming up now in this way. But if you have a fundamental issue of governance, right, you're right, and you don't want to overturn a precedent, you're going to have a lot to do. There's going to be very little. You're going to try to minimize it, and here we have rules, right? Where you're really not allowed to just reject kinetic precedent for whatever reason. The issue from a halachic perspective is having explained all the past evidence, does that mean that there isn't that right? Yeah, when I talk about sometimes where you have these sugya are V-shaped, right? They start off very broadly apart and they go like that, but a V can turn into an X, right? The halakhic development can expand dramatically thereafter. So this sugya ends with a really interesting claim that maybe there is no machloket at all. Right, that's not there in the Yesh Lamidas Sugya. Yesh Lamidas Sugya, there's a claim that's limited to one case. Here, there is a possibility it's limited to one case or another, but there's also a possibility that there's no machloket at all, at least according to some versions. So that's a really interesting thing in its own right. We'll have to try and see, hopefully next week, we'll try and see how Rashi navigates the possibility of a sugya which turns a machloket into a nothing. Okay, with that, the structure of the sugya is presented to opinions, present an array of texts that challenge one person or the other, and often both. And then reach a conclusion. The challenges are not in conceptual order, right? I think that for those of you, the Yesh Lamidat Sugya is structured as all the cases in the Mishnah, all the Braitot relating to Aveda. Then we go progressively further afield. Then we actually go back to the one Braita that matters. Right, That's the Shlomi. So probably that was the original, and everything else, right, is added afterwards, right? That's the right. Although there is one Tirgama, right? And Tirgama is always a giveaway that the question was written knowing the answer in advance, right? Because the Tirgama is a quote from a prior discussion. It's not live in the sugya. Um, so that's important in certain other sugyas. So here we don't have any of those. We do have the peculiarities of Lishna Achrinas, which are peculiar to Temurah, and we'll have to talk about what that means. What that means also, because there's a line in Rashi here that makes that really important. The order of the proofs cited is not as obvious to me here as it is in Yesh Lamidat. So you have to try and figure out exactly what you think the order is. Um, but roughly it covers the vast majority of the relevant cases in Talmudic literature. Right, and we'll see one way of a one way of a linguistically marking that. Okay, so with that, let's take a look at the sugya itself. There we go. Okay. So here we are. Okay, so the sugya begins. All right. Machloket Abaye and Rava. Right. The statement is Kol Milsa Amar Rachmana Lo Savid. Right. That is not Abaye's ipsissim verba. Right. You could easily just as well frame it by putting this Kol Milsa Amar Rachmana Lo Savid Abaye Amar X and Rava Amar Y. Right. So it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that it doesn't be implied in any way that Abaye is the source of the formulation. Right. Why it's in Aramaic is when Amoraic statements, even formal statements, are quoted in Aramaic, and when in Hebrew is not something I know anything about. Right. So Abaye says Kol Milsa, Amar Rachmana Lo Savid, everything about which the Torah says do not do it. Im Avid Mahani. Right. If you do it, it provides some sort of, usually we say benefit, but in this case that may be a bias, and therefore we should say, right, if you do it, it has some sort of effect. Right? It's not right, it's not it's right, it's not meaningless. And the way we have the Gemara is the Isal Gadatach Lo Mani, because if you were to say that it doesn't, am I lucky? Why do you get Malchus? To which Rava gives a reply that seems entirely obvious to me. Right? Rava says Lo Mahani Midi. Rava says it doesn't help, and you have to figure out why he throws in the word Midi. Right? Why doesn't he just say Lo Mahani? The high delaki, but your question, Mishum Da'avar member the Rachmanahu, it's because you violated the Torah. So it's really hard to figure out what Abaye's argument is, right? Rava's argument is pretty straightforward, right? You get Malchus for certain things. The question Rava has to explain is why do you get Malchus for some things and not others? Okay, because God chose. That's you get. Why do you get death for some things and Malchus for others? Right? It's not a Abaye's argument is hard to figure out. The Isal Gedatzach Lo Mahane, if you were to think that it's not effective, why do you get Malchus? So the answer is obvious. You get Malchus for Rava's for Rava's reasons. So that's one problem in Abaye. The second question is the reverse thing is when Rava says Lo Mahani Midi, what does that mean? I killed somebody, they're dead. Right? All sorts of illegal actions have consequences. Those consequences have legal implications, right? We don't declare people not dead just because somebody murdered them, as opposed to their dying of natural causes. Right? So whereas Abaya's rationale is hard to figure out, Rava's statement is hard to figure out. What does it mean? especially when he throws in midi. Okay, so just on the presentation, right, we could speculate widely, but I would say we don't understand Abaya's rationale, and we don't understand Rava's position, and therefore plainly we don't have any understanding of either the scope or reasoning of the machloket.
Sorry, just a question about your second point about Rava.
Yeah.
Um, it just seems like there's an implicit afilu. Afilu lo day, right? Even if it accomplished nothing, who cares? Right? It's not about effect at all. It's about the fact that you violated an isser.
So
Right? We
then,
have
okay,
implicit afilus all the time,
good.
right?
So now
Like
you're
many
getting us
statements you have to read.
you're getting us immediately into what, right, if we were thinking conceptually, to really ask the question, which of the two are they arguing about? Are they arguing about Malkos, or they're arguing about whether things have effects? You're putting an afila to say they don't, right? That there's no right, Abaye says im avid mahani, and Rava says who cares? But then there's no machloket, right, about whether it's avid or not. Machloket is only whether that affects Malkos, right? That is not the simple literary presentation of the machloket at all. Right, we could do that, but it's not at all right. The machloket seems to be that they're having an argument about whether a particular type of effect exists. Right, right. So I don't think that's at all obvious. Um, I guess that we have, if that were the case, then you could never ask a question on Rava from something being effective or not. Right, really, right? You only ask questions about whether something gets malchus or not. So I will have to see if that's true in the sugya. My offhand claim will be that Rava gets asked both kinds of questions. Okay. However, the really clever thing would be to show that Rava is asked, right, if what we really want to do is to try and find a way which are two understandings, and the Lishna Achrinas reflect those understandings alternately. But we won't be able to do that in this, right? That would maybe a semester we could try to do that. Okay, Rabbi Gershom says the following. Right, I want to use Rabbi Gershom just right, not because we're studying all the positions of Rishonim, because I want to treat Rabbeinu Gershom, I think, not unreasonably as sort of the thing which was in front of Rashi when Rashi wrote, and so we can see what Rashi is doing additionally. That's a major historical assumption. I think it works literarily, even if it's not true historically, and if it's true historically, then matova manayim. Right, Yavid Mahani. Kilomar. So the first thing he does is put in a kilomar. Kilomars, right, I think, are really important. It means he's going to tell you something which is not the result of a literal translation. They have to figure out like what is it, right? What is the non-literal translation, or at least what is the choice of available translations that he is making. So Kilomar, Afal Pisha Avar, okay, right, even though you did the thing which the Torah told you not to do, Masha Asa Asui, right, what he did is done. The Lo Mahani, Lo Asakum, Amai Lucky. Okay, so I also thought this would be a good laboratory for trying to figure out. Right, so you've seen, right, that what I try to do is create editions in which the commentaries are integrated. So this was a good laboratory for trying to show what that does and what the challenges are. Okay, so imavid mane. So that tells, right. So the Kolomar tells you alpha pish avar mash asa asui. Okay, it's important to understand that the Kolomar ends at mash asa asui, if I am correct. Okay, and then I'm going to argue that the lo asa klum is not actually supposed to be read consecutively. It's a translation of lo mahani. Right? It's masha asa asoidi lo mahani, because if it doesn't help lo asa klum, then he didn't do anything. Therefore, am I lucky? No, right? Lo mahani means lo asa klum. Okay, and then that's all he says. Right? That concludes it, because the lo mahani the am I lucky is just the right. It's just the end of the sentence. Okay, right. So what he does, right? So what I did in my edition is I crossed out the Sagadata, which I don't think makes a difference, but right. But assuming that he's right, assuming that what we're doing here is quoting the Gemara and inserting commentary. So so he quoted the Gemara and left out the Sagadata. So prima facie, he didn't have Sagadata as Gira, so even though I can't see why it makes a difference here, the Loasa, right? So, right, the Klum is is an import to try and create parallelism with Rava. And that's right. The klum is the parallel to midi, so that's an interesting move. And the big thing is that he translates mahani consistently as asa, which is not a literal translation. That explains why it's a kolomar. The question is, what is he doing by translating mahani as asa? So what I wrote was the purpose of Ben Gershom is to assimilate a phrase that uses different words, right? It's right. It says, if you do it, then it's mehane, to a phrase that uses the same word, right? That's the big shift, and therefore, right, right, what he's doing is taking away any meaning of the word mehane, right? It could have just said him avid. There's no specific right. So the question is, was there a substantive alternative, right? Why does he have to do that? Right? Is there a way in which you could take the word mahane as referring to a particular kind of effect, and he's trying to prevent you from doing that? Okay, that's right. Again, I'm not interested in Ben Gershom for his own right. I'm just putting it out there as right. But A, just so you can see the model, and you can see that there, right, that it's not at all obvious how the edition is created. Right, you have to decide where the kolomar is ended. You have to decide this is a translation. Right? That doing it this way points up, right? You get to see that the klum is the parallel to median. You get to see what he's really doing is constantly translating Mahani as Asa, right? So I hope that shows both that this is not a not a mechanical process, but also that that it automatically yields or that naturally yields an enormous amount of value interpretationally. And with that, we can start looking at Rashi.
Just one point here,
Yeah,
which is that the the translations of the Aramaic into various forms of Assad don't match the actual Aramaic grammar, right? In other
uh,
words, Aved is a
sure.
participle, right? Not a perfect, right?
Hmm.
If it meant Assad, it should have been Avad, right? Similarly, Mahane is also a participle, right? So it's just like he's not translating grammatically. He's translating. I think you said this into a known legal phrase, a known Tanaitic legal phrase, Mashasasui, right? That right, kind of like I think
Absolutely.
it's you know
Good. That was it.
I think it's on
Exactly the
that
next thing I was
level.
going to say. Exactly right. What he's doing is assimilating this machloket amoraim in Aramaic to a known Tannaitic Hebrew phrase. Right. And that means that that what he's telling you is you should really look at all the cases where Masha Asa Asui shows up if you want to understand what the machloket Yavid Mahani is, and that's exactly where we're going. Right. Absolutely right. Okay. So here's now we're going to look at Rashi in comparison. Right. So Rashi says. Lo savid, lo sase. Okay, so Rashi puts the translation of avad as asa right up, right? Mehane, right? Demasha asa asui. That's right. That's all fine. So Rashi is going to be following following the pattern of Rashbam, except he puts in a dalit. He doesn't translate ibavid mehane as right masha asa asui. He says mehane dim masha asa asui. And if we take that dollar significance, so Rashi actually utterly undoes what Rabbi Gershom did. Rabbi Gershom eliminates the distinction between Mahani and Asa, and Rashi puts it right back. Mahani is a consequence of Asa. Okay, right. That's the first thing, just to be right to be clear. Now let's take a look at the way Rashi frames it. Right, creating the dish in the same way. Right, Amar Abaye, Kol Miltam Rachman Lo Savit, so that means Lo Sase. Im Avid Mahani Di Mash Asa Asui. Okay, then Rashi puts in the phrase Ho'il Vilaki. Now, Ho'il Vilaki seems to be a replacement for the line Isal Gedatach Lo Mahani Amai Lucky. Right? It's not right. Right. He doesn't just not have Salgadatach. Right. He doesn't comment on the entire line. He seems to replace it. So that at least raises the possibility that Rashi's Girsa didn't have an explanation for Abaye at all. Now, all the manuscripts do, but I'm not convinced that we have a sufficient variety of manuscripts to tell us what's going on. So I just put out there that that it's possible that Rashi is adding in an explanation or actually that this was Rashi's Girsa as opposed to what we have. And I'm going to raise this question because I think it's a critical question whether Rashi's explanation is different than the explanation we have in the Gemara. Although I want to hold off raising that until we read through all of Rashi. Okay, Rava says Lo mani midi kid mefaresh lekaman. So this is interesting only because why would we explain Abaye and not Rava? Right? Why Mahani? We already explained the Masha Asa Asui. Lo Mahani midi, that is explained later. Right? Right? So something Rashi thinks cannot be or should not be explained here. right? Even though parallel, right, that's a real puzzle. He also didn't have klum up here, right? Because it doesn't, right? Because right, because right, it's not. There's no place where it would fit, right? Because he doesn't have the lamahani. Okay, so that's and then B he says hachi garsinan v'hai delaki mishum de avar amim rachmanahu. So having right, so he doesn't have our explanation of Abaye. Maybe he had no explanation of Abaye, and he had a text which had some different, which had either no explanation of Rava or a different explanation of Rava, and he chooses to insert the explanation of Rava. So sort of ironically, Rashi refuses to explain Rava's position. He said that'll be explained below, but he insists on explaining Rava's rationale. And so it's hard for me to believe there isn't something really important, really significant going on in all these things. Okay, so now what? Right. So having set out what the right, assuming that I'm correct here, right, and I gave you the text of Rashi as it appears in Vilna, and there are, so far as I can tell, no significant differences in manuscript, although I haven't provided a transcription um, of the manuscript. So assuming that I'm right about that, that nothing in the manuscript matters or isn't obviously wrong. The major changes in manuscripts are all, to me, obvious homotoleitons, right, where they just skip lines. Um, so what is Rashi doing with all these things, right? Hoil v'laki different, can the farish come on, but explaining it up here, putting in the dalid, and hachi garsina. Okay, so I'm right.
Just
So I
sorry,
want,
just
yeah,
just one. I don't know if it's a point or a question about the Hachikar Sinan.
yeah.
My sort of methodological approach is always, well, let me look at all the manuscripts and see what words are missing that Rashi puts in. So
There are getting.
there is one, Mishum. Mishum is only in the Defusim,
Ah,
or
correct. That is
Defus,
true.
the Nitzia and Menchen. All the others lack Mishum. So
That's
it's
true.
possible that Rashi is inserting the word Mishum, and then you have to ask, why did he think that the versions without Mishum could have been read differently?
That's
Right? That
correct. Yeah,
the
sorry, you're right.
avar or something else.
You're
Anyway,
right. My fault. Right. I couldn't think of a difference. So right, that right, like because the deal already is causal, so I couldn't think of a difference. But you're entirely right. That's for the failure of not providing a transcription. Um, oh, you'll see, I have a different hypothesis, but it's only a hypothesis. Okay, and right, does Rashi not have the line "Disagadata"? The whole line, right? Which open because if he has that line, then Hoil Velaki can't mean anything different than this. But if he doesn't have the line, then Hoil Velaki could conceivably mean something different than our rationale. Right, and so here's where I think there could be a difference, but it's not. It's a. It might be as far with with only a very short half-life. I thought that if you read Masha Asa Asui Ho Il Vilaki means that the Malkos are causal. The reason that you get the reason that what you do is effective is because you get Malkos. The line that we have, "Disal Lo Mahani Amai Lucky," says that they are not causal. It's informational. From the fact that you get Malkos, you can derive that it must have worked. Otherwise, why won't you get Malkos? So I tried this out on numerous people. My wife thinks I'm just wrong, and However lucky could be in both. My nephew thinks that I'm right, but it's impossible. So it must, right? So even the Hoyle Lucky should mean what I say it is, right? It doesn't actually. No one has presented a version of a form of Hoyle that is informational as opposed to causal. So I want to suggest that that you have to take into account really the really serious possibility um, that Rashi is making a causal claim. Somehow Malkos have an effect, and I would further suggest that that relates to Rashi's insertion of the prefix di as opposed to as opposed to mahani. Um, right, and really, what we want to say is that holy lucky it's mahani, right, because masha, right, that's something like that. But I can't prove it, right? That's just a working hypothesis in the sugya. It does seem to me linguistically compelling, but I can tell you, that the people I have consulted, I asked somebody else also, forget who else I asked, and they fudged, I think. So, right, so you can take your choice. Okay. Um, okay, obvious questions you have to ask, right, is either is it all do all punishments prove something? What right does it mean that you say it's lo mahani if you don't get malchus, or do we say no? The fact of punishment in any case proves the concept. Right, and Malchus is just an example. The fact that you can be punished proves that you must do something. Because why would God ever punish you if you can't do anything? Again, but that's just nonsense. Because you can get punished because you kill somebody, right? There are all sorts of things, right? So again, I think the question is obvious. The answer is not. Okay, what does the word media add, and does Rashi have it? Right, right. And I gave you one possible way which it could matter. Right, we asked why does Rav need to explain later when Abai is explained now, and what was the alternative girsa? So my best get to alternative girsa is it didn't have the Haidulaki. Right, and that would change. That would have the same kind of shift, right? Because if we had lo mahani midi mishum da'avad ameimad rachmanahu, so what we're saying is right. We're saying is that the violation of the memra is what causes it not to work. Whereas this way, we're saying lo mahani midi, and you get malkos because you get violated, right? That's a very different claim that the avra meimad rachmana causes the malkos, as opposed to it causes the lo mahani midi. I don't know how to make sense of the claim "Lo mahani midi b'mishud avar mem rachmanahu," as right. That doesn't seem more of an argument. It doesn't seem an argument. It just seems a restatement. But I guess I could figure out how to make it. But that would explain to me why it's important for Rashi to put Navi Garcina. Right. It put the Hachi Garcia next, right? The Hachi Garcia, right. So that's my best bet. That was his Gersa was ahead of the Haida Lucky because I have nothing. I read that the whole. I don't have any version in which the whole line is missing. Uh, it it seems too much for me to claim that he put in the whole line. So I was trying to figure out the speculation, like what's the most likely thing that could drop out. That's to me is the most likely thing that could drop out. Um, okay. So with that, right now we're going to move on to let's move on to checking what Masha Asa Soy means and whether it can give us any guidance in trying to figure out right what both Rabbeinu Gershom and Rashi are doing. So the answer is going to be, as you can imagine, not so much. um, let's see, where do we have Masha Asa Asoy? So we have one beautiful case, right, which is or it's really two beautiful cases, Chalitza and right, and because Yuma come in the bottom. I didn't give you Yuma in the end. Okay, because Yuma was more complicated. Yuma is about last case, right? So here's Chalitza, it's a Mishnah, right? Starting with the cases of the Mishnah. So, sorry, the Gemara, right? So Bida says that the mitzvah of Chalitza is in order, right? You should be korev, korat, right? Korev, korev, chalitza, rakav, korah. And the Gemara says, hang on a sec, isn't that obvious in the Mishnah? The answer is no. What we derive from Rabbi Yehuda, right, when he uses the word mitzvah, even though the Mishnah already gave us the order, is mitzvah hachi v'afich let lanba. It's a mitzvah to do it that way, but if you do it out of order, we have nothing against you. Okay, and then there's a Breita that is allegedly says the same thing, which says that if you reverse the order, it's Masha Asa Asui. Okay, so in the Breita, Masha Asa Asui means that you reverse the order and the thing counts anyway, even though you didn't fulfill the positive commandment to do it in a particular way. Right? So Masha Asa Asui means you did something in an you did something which did not fulfill all the requirements of the law, and nonetheless the law recognizes you as having accomplished what you set out to accomplish legally. Right? In other words, this is a violation of the principle Shlo Yehei Niskar. You did it, or at least right, you gain something from having done it the wrong way, but not really. You don't get anything more. Right? I guess you get the same result, so it's not really a violation. You get the same result doing it wrong as if you had done it right.
I just want to
This,
point out that's a very formalistic way of reading mitzvah. Mitzvah often in Tannaitic literature is just means the best way to do it, the right procedure, right? You know, mitzvah to do it this way, but it doesn't really matter, right? In other words, not being a formal like as a mitzvah to say to do it in this particular order, and if you don't do it, you were mevatel
okay,
anase,
good.
whatever.
Right, very right. What I haven't talked about at all is what the authority of the mitzvah is. Okay, right. So this could right. It could just be minhag. It could right, just be right, right. So that's right. That's why this. I'm starting off with this case because you could make those arguments. You have to look at the Mishnah and see whether you think that's right or not. And now there is an achronish concept, right, which I think doesn't work, but which is famous for claiming there's no b'diavad d'oraisa. That right. and b'diavad is a rabbinic concept, but the Torah things are absolute. So if you start off with the premise that there's no deoraisa b'diavad, you would have to say, okay, this can't actually be a mitzvah to say. But I think that doesn't work. It's part of the same thing that believes there's no gzera deoraita, and there are gzeras deoraisa. Also, I remember I had that argument in 10th grade, so I'm very biased about this. With the fellow who later became head of the Chaf K. I said, you can't be gzera deoraisa. That was my first use of the Encyclopedia Talmudit, which has happily several examples of exera deraisa, including one that I had proposed. Each of those could be explained differently, so you could theoretically construct an understanding of, let's say, Bal Yira, Bal Yimatzi on Pesach, and Bal Tikravu, and all those things where they're not really exeris deraisa, they're intrinsically usher, but Tasha, there's exera deraisa and there's a b'diavad deraisa also. Okay. Uh, the second thing is Makti and Truma Bikurim and Master Rishon Truma Master Sheni Rishon. Afal Pishu Over Belot Ase Masha Asa Asui. So here's really straightforward. Shnemar Melayadcha V'Dimacha Lo Te'acher. Now the important thing is that the pasuk doesn't prove Masha Asa Asui. Right? All the pasuk proves is that there's a Lo Te'ase. Okay, right. That seems like a really good proof. And Masha Asa Asui means you did something, right? You did something illegal, and nonetheless it has a legal effect. Right, so we could, and the thing to do is to limit Abai and Rava to machloket, right, where the mahani or the asui is a question of whether things that exist only in the legal world, right, can they be accomplished by illegal actions? Okay, right. So then we have the Mishnah Bechoros, which is talking about errors, right? Errors of judgment. So your judgment is Masha Asa Asui, but here it's not clear what the violation is. You just got it wrong, and it's not clear what the authority is. So that's not going to help us much at all. We have the Mishnah Basra, which has Masha Asa Asui Aval Inra Chachamim Nocha Himenu. So that tells, right. So that also tells that's a really weak one. Um, we have in Torah Minat Tamei Ala Tahor in Trumos where we start making fancy distinctions. Shogeg, right? Shogeg and Mezid. The important thing about this for us is Rabbi Yehuda says Afal Pishu Shogeg Lo Asa Klum. So that tells us where the phrase Lo Asa Klum comes from in Rabbi Gershom. It also suggests that maybe the question of whether it works or not, whether Masha Asa or not, is a discretionary category. Right, the Machlokes of Abai and Rava, in which case the Machlokes of Abai and Rava is really not about how to explain particular precedents in the sense of, all right, it's not a question of whether it should always be this way, it should always be that way. The question is when should it be this way, and when should it be that way? But that is not anything the Sugya ever raises as a possibility. Right, but that is something Masha Asa, so he could raise for it. And then we have Yom Kippur, where where again you have the phrase Lo Asa Klum, Migzim Asa Lechaver Lo Asa Klum. This is the inverse of the sugya about chalitza, and here again it seems like it's discretionary, even though Rabbi Yochanan explains the machloket between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemia on the basis of a pasuk. Right, so right, but it doesn't. If the Tanakhama is a different position, right now the question of whether the Tanakhama is a different position is a famous machloket in many cases about whether you have an anonymous position followed by two Tanakh positions, which can either be viewed as interpretations of that position, or as alternatives, right? So that's an old machloket. You can figure out what you think the structure of the Mishnah is. I think academics tend to much prefer the position that the two Tanakh positions are both explanations of the Tanakhama. But it's a machlokes Rishonim and Achronim in every case, and who says there has to be one explanation in all of them? Okay, so that's right. So that's Masha Asasui. I would say that the best evidence of it is that it doesn't actually support any kind of general rule, and which could then support a machloket, which would have right, which would end up exactly the way we end up. Because the sugya never considers the possibility, because the whole goal of the sugya is just to explain all the precedents, but leaves room, right? But once you explain all the precedents, then you can do whatever you want in the future, right? So that might very well accord with the outcome, It doesn't tell you ever what the authority is for Masha Asa Asui. None of them, all the Mishnayot only give you right, only give you authority for the violation at different levels. They never give you authority for the outcome. So that right, that's a really interesting thing, and that's therefore I think it's reasonable for the sugya to start from the premise that it has no idea where that comes from, and therefore the sugya starts off with the premise, oh, outcomes. That's a question of svara, even though we don't understand the svaras. Right? We know that you can have outcomes Ramasha Asa Asui. We know that you can have outcomes Ramasha Asa Eino Asui, Shogeg and Mezid. Right? Big day Levan, big day Levan, big day, right? Big day Zahav. We have also we know that there's all right they're also right there's mumcha right mumcha though it's not exactly on the same axis right but right so we know that we can have both outcomes. Nobody ever provides us a rationale. I think that's a reasonable way for right to get us into the sugya, and maybe that's what the Rishonim are doing by assimilating Abaye to that right to the language of Masha Asa Asui and assimilating Rava to the position of Lo Asa Klum. And they're not claiming it's a machlokas tanaim. They're just saying, oh, look, both these are options. Okay, then I thought we should take a look at the raya from Temurah. Right, there's a right. Temurah is I don't know the sixth raya or something like that. Right, it shows again. This is not a sugya that's specifically related to Temurah. So let's take a look at how it functions. So the Gemara says, "Vari Temurah, Damar Rachmana lo yachlifenav lo yamirato, the Tana lo shadamar shayla mira lo shebehemir mumar v'sofeget harbayim." Okay, so here's our case. You're not allowed to do it. If you do it, it works, and you get Malchus. Okay, who does that prove? So the Gemara says, Alam Mahani. Okay, it says, Imemir Mumar. Okay, so it works. Tufta de Rava. Okay, now here we get to the difficulty of the argument, and you get Malchus. Rava could say, well, maybe it works only because you get Malchus, and it doesn't work when you don't get Malchus. That doesn't seem to be, in this line of the Gemara, a possible explanation of Rava's position. Right? Rather, Rava says it never works, even if you get Malchus. Okay? So Rava says, no, it's different there because there's a pasuk that says it works. And right, you always have the question whenever you have a pasuk that says it works, you can say this is a binav, or you can say this is or you can say this is a chiddush. So Rava says, I treat this as a chiddush. I don't learn from Vayahu V'Smirasoyi Kodesh that Masha Asa Asui. I learned that Masha Asa Eino Asui unless there's a pasuk. Now, one of the issues, at the end of the sugya, there will be nine psukim, right? Right. So if you're a formalist, you'll say, hang on a second, what at some point, right? You got to say, right? Shnei ksuvim, right? There's got to be a rule. That what happens if you have more, right? If you have so many psukim, but the answer is there isn't. You can do whatever you want. Okay. So, right. So Rava, right. So Rava says I have a pasuk. So Gemara says, okay, according to Abaye, what do I need? Right now, there's a pasuk. What does Abaye do with that pasuk? So the easy answer for Abaye should be, yeah, that pasuk is been out. Right, but then he's going to have to explain every other pasuk. Right, so not clear that helps him, but the Gemara is going to make him explain every pasuk like this anyway. So it's not entirely clear how fair the question of Abaye is. Nonetheless, the Gemara gives the answer to Abaye. Ilav dam rachmana v'hayot tmurato. Having a teitzev tzikanizu kamash malan. So Abaye says, no, there's still a chiddush. It says v'yahu usmuraso kodesh. Right, so there's a chiddush. You can tell me it should have just said v'ya, right, v'haya smuraso kodesh, but then he would have said, oh, that's a mute designed to right. So right, there's no way around it. Abaye has a really good answer. Rav also has a really good answer. So the end, right, the end, this exactly where you should be. You know what? This doesn't prove anything. Right, that's right. That's basically where everything ends. The arguments are more or less compelling. Okay, then I'll just to tell you the end of the sugya. The end of the sugya raises three possibilities as to what the machlok is actually about. That right, those are for next week. But just so we have the structure of the sugya, right? We have the machloket with all its ambiguities. We have Temurah as a model of how you solve these problems, which is, oh look, there's a pasuk. The pasuk could either be coming to teach me this because it's not true everywhere else, or the pasuk could be coming to teach me this is true just like it's true everywhere else. Right? Go, you can go home now. What are the machlokas about? So one machlok is about the machlok about ribis ksutza. So the machlok being a ribis ksutza means, oh, really, this is just the machlokas tanaim. The machlokes about Shuna Kona, that's that's like a machlokes that's gone on throughout all of history at a much broader abstract, on a broad abstract level. Fine, and maybe it's just much more storms. Those are your three options at the end of the sugya. But I'm not really sure what to do about it because the machloket could be about 1,000 cases that aren't addressed anywhere else. Right? So I don't really understand what the Gemara is doing at the end of Yesh Midas. It makes sense to say we've explained so many cases, all right, at the end of Yesh Midas in Aveda that it no longer seems as if there's anything left to argue about. It specifically, what happened in the Yesh Midas sugya is that we have whittled Rava's position away to nothing. Or sorry, whittled Abaya's position away to nothing. Right? There are so many, right? That because the answers are conceptual. Right? Abaye is in the Yesh Midas Abaye is regularly forced to concede Yesh Midas unless it's this or unless it's this, not because of psukim, but because intellectually his position, right, he has to concede the precedents tell you that there are cases where there are lots of cases where the person doesn't know about it, and certainly where I don't know the person knows about it, and nonetheless we let you keep it. Um, Right. So in the end, the progress of the Yesh Lamedat Sugya is the Machlokes Abaye and Rava can only be about a particular case mentioned in a pasuk, because rationally there is right. Rationally, Abaye has already conceded the point, but here all the terutzim are about psukim. So that should mean in every new case where there isn't the pasuk, there should be machlokes. So I don't really understand the structure of the sugya, and that's we'll try and see next week. I'm not prepared on it yet. Try and see next week if Rashi or anybody else tries to explain what the sugya is doing, since in the end it seems to end up in a not great place. I do think, as we've explained, that Masha Asasui does a really good job of explaining what really is happening in the sugya. It just doesn't end up where it should then, which is just say, oh yeah, it's just a matter of discretion. Okay, so with that, what I really wanted to focus on, and we'll see how much we get of it, um, is the first raya. 'Cause I think, right, I think I'm not planning to do any of the others because I think if we can understand the first kasha teretz sequence, then we'll probably understand everything about the sugya. If we follow it through. So it has two versions. There's a Meisvei and there's a Lishon Achrina. So I want to do it first with the Ben Gershom and then do it with Rashi. So here's the Meisvei. Meisvei onis shegiresh im Yisrael hu machazir ve'eno loke. So we all know there's an implicit but in Kohen hu right right eno machazir ve'loke. Right, and it's not right. We know that that's going to be at the end of the text, because the capacity to be machzir is right doesn't exist for a Kohen because the Kohen right, because the Kohen can't marry a divorcee. The implication of that second line, unquestionably, is that the divorce has a legal effect. And the legal effect is that a Kohen can't remarry her. That being the case, the conversation should really be over. Right? The congregation should really be over because right, it's obvious that Abaye is right and Rava is wrong. Right? Divorcing a rape victim is effective because it creates the issue for a Kohen. That the Sugi doesn't do that is endlessly mysterious to me. So let's try and look at what the Sugi actually does. Okay, Onesh Shagirish Im Yisrael Hamachos Reino Loka. So the first version of the Sugya, we never mention the Kohen at all. Right? Instead, we say, I Amris, Kevan de Avar Amemer de Rachmana Lucky, if you make the claim that Rava made, that you get Malkos because you violate the Torah, Hanami Lucky. So the Yisrael should also get Malkos, because after all, he violated the Torah in the same way that the Kohen did. So if you think that the driver of the Malkos is the violation and not the result, right? So this clearly seems to think, right, that the way we should understand Abaye is Abaye says that the result drives the Malkos. Rava says no, right, the Machlokas is about what drives the Malkos. Abaye says the result drives the Malkos. Rava said right. Rava says the Rava says the violation tries to Malkos. That's why Will wanted to say what he said, right? But it's a difficult linguistic move. Okay, so to Rava, so Rava's wrong. Right, Rava's wrong because he because it's clear that the it's only the Malkos. It's only the effect that drives the Malchus. The it's because right. There's also a nami, right? So we know the result of the coin, right? So the Divrei Rava is really that the Yisrael doesn't get Malchus even though the Kohen does. Amar Lach, the response is Shani Hasan Amar Kra Kol Yamav, which means Kol Yamav B'Amud V'Hachazir. So Rava says that is different. What is different? It's different, right? In our right reading it through, it's the Yisrael not getting Malchus is different because something about this pasuk is the reason he gets the Malchus. At which point the Gemara we should know the pattern from Temurah, although that Temurah is later in the sugya. Which point the Gemara says, yeah. So then, if the purpose of that pasuk is to tell you that you don't get Malchus, then right, Yisrael doesn't get Malchus. So according to Abaye, why don't you get Malchus? So Abaye says, because there's a different, right? There's a different nafkamina. The nafkamina is, that I would have thought without the pasuk that he didn't, that the Yisrael doesn't have to remarry her. So the pasuk teaches me that the Yisrael does have to remarry her, which means that Rava must use the pasuk to teach something other than that the Yisrael must remarry her. What is that? Okay, right. So this right offhand, right, the dialogue makes beautiful sense formally and little sense substantively. So let's see what the Rishonim try to do with this. Rabbi Gershom, Alabaye kevad lo mahani kedamor and Yisrael machzer and loke the chayav lahachazir. Right, Rabbi Gershom leaves Rava out fine. He thinks Rava is fine. He's only right, which is good. Right, we can explain Rava. Rava can explain all sorts of ways. The question is like, what is Abaye saying that's different than Rava? So Rabbi Gershom picks right says Alabaye kevad lo mahani kedamrinan im Yisrael machzer and loke the chayav lahachazir. Okay, so according to Abaye, right, since he concedes that since he concedes that the Yisrael is required to be machazir, whatever that means, and that's right, and that's what the Mishnah says. Therefore, l'tama ma'isrich kol yamav. So since Rava said apparently that the purpose of chayav lachazir is to create the chiyuv, that right according to right Abaye, but Abaye thinks that chiyuv already exists. Why does Abaye think that chiyuv already exists? Because that's what lo mahani means. And that's a big claim, right? Lo mahani doesn't mean the divorce isn't defective. Lo mahani means the divorce, right, that he can't get what he wants out of the divorce. Where did that come from? Um, okay. So Ilav Dam Rachmana, right? So Abaye says Ilav Dam Rachmana Kol Yamav. Abaye says no. If it weren't for Kol Yamav, I would have thought that Isur Avadle Ibay Lehader V'Ibay Lo Lehader. I would have thought that he did the violation, and he can remarry her or not, and he still doesn't get Malchus. Kamash Malan, he doesn't get Malchus, and he's Chayav Lachazir. Is that why he doesn't get Malchus? We don't know. So the Gershom says, Israch Sagadatach, he loved it, right? He doesn't, right? The only thing Rabbi Gershom puts in is this Chayav Lachazir, right? That which makes perfect sense formally, right? Since the Gemara's answer is that there's no Chiyav Lachazir, so it must be that what the previous pasuk Amod V'Hachazir meant there's a Chiyav Lachazir. And so the Havim, right? We can structure the Gemara according to Ben Gershom as follows: hey, according to Rava, according to Rava, why doesn't the Israel get Malchus if the Kohen does? The answer, according to Rava, is that the Israel doesn't get Malchus because he has a chiyuv to remarry her, and that chiyuv serves in place of Malchus somehow. Or if you want, that chiyuv prevents the Malchus. All right, you'll see why I'm leaving that open. Okay, whereas Abaye said, hang on, so according to Abaye, right? According to Abaye, there's a chiyuv machzir anyway because that's what lo mahani means. And the answer is yeah, but I would have thought that there was no. I thought that you don't need the chiyuv to get the Malkos, and right, I would have thought you don't right. I would have thought you don't need the chiyuv. Sorry, I would have thought you don't need the chiyuv to get the Malkos. Right? And Abai says Mahani just means that you don't have to. Mahani means according to Abai all the way. But I could end up with a Mahani where he gets exactly what he wants and he still doesn't get Malkos. Right? That's the Havmina for Abai. That's the radical Havmina for Abai. Right? It's Mahani, and I still might not get Malkos. And I have no chiyuv to fix it. Right? Why would that be true? Why don't I get Malkos? Okay, interesting question. Rabbi Gershom provides no. Right, the only piece of evidence Rabbi Gershom reply, the only thing Rabbi Gershom contributes to the whole sugya is the chayav, right, is the chayav lachazir. Okay, um, yeah, let's leave the. Okay, then we'll look at the second version, Lishna Achrina. So in the Lishna Achrina, the Meitve quotes both parts of the Breita, but this time it says it's right. It says the problem of Yisrael is a tiyufta de Abaye because Abaye says Behani, and hang on a sec, he's machazir. What's the big deal? She's divorced. We already proved that, right? That the Kohen can't remarry her. It has effect. It's just isn't right. So does Abaye really think that Mahani means that the Torah can never command you to to undo the issue you did? Okay, problem. All right. So Shani Hassam Abaye says no. Right. The reason that you have to be machzir is not because of a general principle, because there the Torah tells you have to be machzir. Okay. So according to Rava, it should be obvious that they machzir, right? Why does the Torah have to write this way? So the answer is, I would have thought, according to Rava, that you should get malchus and then you should have to return it. Right? Right? Because it's only a lav. And right, what is the pasuk doing? The pasuk is turning into a lo taseh ani taklase. So the question asked then is there a substantive difference, right? When we said chayav l'hachazir in the first version, is that the same thing as saying lavani taklase in the second version? In which case, right, this is just a perfectly common, version where the sugya just exists, multiplied by -1, right? Nothing's different between the two versions. If you look at the way Rabbi Gershom says it, Katani Mia Misrael right? So the just interesting thing is where he puts in an explanation of Abaye, but really there's no reason to assume that there is. I think that there's a substantive difference. Okay, now let's take a look at what Rashi does. Here's Rashi. Hanam lucky. So Rashi first of all puts in a kilomar. Woo! What's the problem? Right? Rabbi Gershom didn't put a kilomar. Rabbi Gershom just said, right, the chayiv lachazir. Rashi puts in a kilomar. And his kilomar, he feels compelled to explain Abaye's position and not just the kasha on Rava. Right? But Gershom said nothing about the kasha, only about the second kasha on Abaye. Rashi thinks that the first thing requires a massive explanation. So what's his explanation? Kilomar. Tinach le Abaye, Damar dehechad mahani lilaki, lachi katani hachad einu loke, dehalo mahani mai de'avad, sheyachol lachazira. Okay, so Rava says that the premise, right, according to Abaye, it's perfectly fine that he doesn't get Malkos because he could undo it. So right, so for Abaye, we're saying you don't get Malkos because you only get Malkos if it's Mehani, and here it's not Mehani. Okay, so now it's not right. So all right, so according to Rashi, the causal structure in Abaye is in the first version is that Malkos are caused by the Mehani, and they're caused by the permanence of the Mehani, not by the legal effect of the Mehani, but by the permanent practical effect of the Mehani. So that's Abaye. El Ravad Amar Lo Mahani, Vayid Laki Mishum Davar Mimir Rachmana, Hacha, Afal Gav Lo Mahani, Lo Kenami Mishum Davar Mimir Rachmana. Okay, right. So the Rava is perfectly fine. So Yuchal Shalcha Kol Yamav, right? That's the answer. Shani Hasim, because it says Yuchal Shalcha Kol Yamav. The Mashma Kol Yamav Lo Yuchal Shalcha. Duh. Okay, what does that mean? The Imgirish Yachazir. What? No. Right. The Imgirish Lo Imgirish Inana Megareshet. right? The kol yamav, the kol yamav b'amod v'hachazir kai. So that's a really difficult thing to say. The best way to read it I can think of is to say that we have to explain the pasuk as saying, right, lo yuchal garsha kol yamav. He can't divorce her permanently. It's not a lota say. It's a statement of fact. Right. The Torah says, right, mean the Torah says that in this case, um, that in this case, he can return. Really weird, right? So Shani Hassan Amar, so Rav
Sorry,
is
sorry.
so
I just want to point
yeah,
out, as
yeah.
I want to point out, it's actually a cool parallel to the Hashavat Veda stuff, right? Because it says there, "Lo tuchal lihitalem." What do you mean? Of course
Aha,
I can, right?
aha.
I'm just not supposed to.
Okay, that's interesting. That's I have to think about that. Okay, so then let's look at the next slide. Is just absolutely stunning. Right, we're trying to explain this for Rava, right? So according to Rava, right, we're trying to explain according to Rava according to Rava why doesn't the Yisrael get Malkos? So Rava says because there's a pasuk that says you have to return it. Good, that just makes it like everything else. It's not mehani, and you get Malkos. So Rava says no. V'hilchach lo avar amemra dirachmana, according to Rashi. We didn't actually violate the Torah. What on earth does that mean? Even to Lavanita Glase, you violated the Torah, just you're doing something else. So this is an amazing one. I have no idea. Clearly, Rashi is trying, is doing something really important here. I don't know what he's doing. Right? Hilchach lo avar ameimrad rachmana. So you could say he thinks the Isur is being megaresha to kol right, to kol yamav, and so if he sends her away, as long as he successfully remarries her in time, he never violates the Isur. Maybe that's what he thinks all Lavanita Glases are. Right, that's a really big chiddush. Right, it's according right that the reason you don't get malchus for Lavanita Glase is because you did not violate it. Now, that makes it parallel to the question of bitlo, bitlo, and as opposed to I forget what the other phrase is, the machlokas about Lavanita Glase, which what happens if you can no longer do it? Like, so do we give you malchus if she dies? Right? Do we give you malchus if she marries somebody else? Right, really, like all sorts of wild nafkaminas, if that's really what Rashi's saying. And it's very hard for me to believe that's really what he's saying, and yet that's what it says. Okay, Alma, Mahani, Mishum de Over Rachmana. But everywhere else, even though it doesn't make a difference, that's fine. The only reason, but here you don't get Malkos because I don't know, because the Torah says Does that mean that's a chiyuv? I don't know. Right? Rashi doesn't say the word chiyuv ever. So we'll see. Is all the Bach and the Vilna Gaon, right, in different, not necessarily in the same place, keep on trying to substitute chayav for yachol in Rashi. But all the manuscripts have yachol, and up here, it seems pretty clear that's what he means. I think. So I'm not convinced at all that they're right, but I can't tell you for sure they're wrong. Um, Okay. Well, further, L'baye, Damar Heichad Mahani Lucky of Ilo Mahani Lo Lucky, right? So here Rashi spells it out, right? In this language, according to Abaye, you only get Malkos in cases which are Mahani. So the Machlokes in Abaye and Rava is whether you get Malkos in a case which is not Mahani. Now, is there a second Machlokes about when things are Mahani? Maybe, because that means that every time you get Malkos, Abaye has to explain that, well, that's because you're Mahani and Rava doesn't. So it could be that there's a fundamental machlokas, which is why you get malchus, and there's a downstream machlokas, which is once you have such a machloket, it turns out that Abaye and Rava have to offer different explanations of the same outcome, right? But not that I don't know if that's necessarily the way it works, but it's clearly according to Rashi, it is true that according to Abaye, you should not get that if it didn't help, you shouldn't get malchus, and therefore, if you get malchus, that is a siman, right? That it worked. So today, Ma'asrich lemichtav kol yamav the koy b'amod v'achazir v'hachi loloki mishum dehavi kum asay afilu l'kasav kol yamav shaminu l'idei deloki kevin l'mahani the yachol. There we are again. The yachol achazir. This is an amazingly long sentence, right? L'idei l'ma'asrich lemichtav. I hope I'm parsing it correctly. According to him, why does it have to write kol yamav to teach us that he's a mod v'achazir and therefore he doesn't get malchus because of kum asay? Nonetheless, he wouldn't get malchus. Right? Right? That. Right. That. It. That. Right. That. Right. That. Right. 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 because you could be mad, right? So I think the only way to read it is, right, you say now it's a, according to Abaye, why do I need a pasuk to tell me that it's a chiyuv? I wouldn't get Malchus any, right? I would, right, what, I wouldn't, right, why do I need, what, according to the way Rashi is reading, according to Rava, the pasuk comes to tell me that there is a chiyuv, and that's why you don't get Malchus. But according to Abaye, you didn't get Malchus anyway, so what do I need the pasuk for? So the answer is I need the pasuk for the chiyuv. Okay, it's a little bit awkward, all right? And the end Rashi says, right? So v'hashta koyima babun v'achazir koy v'ilchach lo lucky v'lav bishum davikum asay. So the havamina is you have an option. The maskana is the Torah tells you that you have a chiyuv to return it, but not because it's a but it's not a kumase. Really, really hard to figure out exactly what that means. It seems that Rashi is trying to find a way that according to Abaye is not a lavanita klase, but really, really complicated to figure out. Okay, list of problems. Um, all sorts of challenges in the right that the gave the Villanelle, which we're not going to have time to do, I think, to try and figure out. 'Cause I think I need to get to the next stage to try and figure out exactly what the Gaon is trying to say and how he fits it in. You can just see that at the end, the Gaon essentially right, offers a really wild claim. So "V'nirli la'abai lav kushe el divrei Gemarahu." Right, that this answer that the Gemara is giving is not really Abaye's answer; it's just the Gemara's answer for itself, and uses Abaye as a stand-in, and it doesn't really follow. Right, this is an amazing claim by the Gemara. Right, this is one of the claims. Forget the Gemara sounding like an academic. If an academic said it, you would like say, "What?" Right, that's a really, really fair way to explain it. Right, to explain the sugya that right, we're just saying something according to Abaye that doesn't follow from Abaye's position. Okay, I used the Gemara only to point out the difficulty. Okay, Lishna Achrina. Um, okay, so how does Rashi read the second version? Um, so here, um, here there are places where the crossouts are the places where things are missing in one of the versions. I don't think that they make a real difference, but I left them in there just so you can so you can see them. So Lishna Achrina is a tirsa de Abaye because we see why Damar Leel the Chazina Hacha de below Yuchal Shalcha Kol Yamav de Lo Mahani de Yochel Lahachzira. Okay, that again, that's just a totally weird thing. The Yochel Lahachzira, that's really weird. If you replace this one with the Chayev, it's really tempting. But really, really, right, you have to figure out what Lo Mahani means and why even Chayev should make a difference since in fact it divorces her. Okay, so that's a kasha to Abaye, but according to Rava, here at least it makes sense. Rava is right. Rava, of course, you right the Yachol Achzir Lo Mahani. The only question is why, according to Rava, you should have to be Machazir her. Okay, Amar Lachabai. Shani Hasan Damar Kra Koyamav, Kilomar Be'alma Mahani, V'hacha Be'onis Shagirish, Lahachi Lo Mahani, right? That I think is a typo, where the places which have Machazir, it could be the same, right? Right, Mishum, De Ktiv Koyamav, De Koyamav Bamod V'hachazir Koy. Okay, so really it's Mahani, all right. So Bai explains, no, really it's Mahani. Um, and right, but the fact that you have to return it doesn't undermine the mahaniness. It's a separate obligation, right? This is a really fancy lumdish claim. The outcome is the result in both cases. Just in one case we say, "Oh no, it didn't work." In the other case, say, "Oh, it worked. We're just making you do it anyway." Okay. The Rav Amarlach, Kilomar, the Rav Amar, the Kol Lo Sashes to return Lo Mahani. L'didei l'may hilchos Israel mitzvah kol yamav. So kol yamav lashin the kol yamav hachzir pshita. The bechol duchta nami shulotos asay lamhani. Right. So Rava, if that Abaye is doing is to tell you it didn't work, the whole purpose of Abaye here is just to tell you it didn't work, so it never works. Okay. So right. So Rava says the reason that it tells you this here is to tell you that you don't get malchus. Now this finally makes sense. Right, Abaye's position is really dochik. Right, end up saying right, the outcome is the same. It's just that right, right? But really, here it tells us that even though it works, right, you still have to do it. But Rava makes perfect sense. Okay, what matters to us, however, is the final Rashi, and that's where I think where we should conclude. Um, okay. Right. So Mishani Rava Iloks Yukol Yamav Havamina Lilaki Mishum Da Avari Amemad Rachmana V'Adonai Harale Shei Machzir Lachar Sheilaka. So Rava says the reason it says Kol Yamav is to tell you that you don't get Malchus at all. I would have thought you get Malchus, and then you have to return her. Why should your returning prevent you from getting Malchus? So right, so Rava's giving right. So that Rava's answer is it tells you don't get Malchus. Why? Presumably because of Lavanita Glase. Okay. Um, right. That's pretty explicit in in the next one. Okay. Then we get to Have Ones. Fine. So the end. What matters to me in Rashi is the last line. Rashi says Lahach Lishna Havia Hachi Kula Maskana Dishmaita. Okay. So now what that phrase means is a little bit difficult to parse, but the pashtus of that phrase is that Rashi says there is a substantive difference between the first and second lashonot. And the ending of the sugya works only according to the second one and not the first. Um, right? Kula have a kula maskana d'shmaita. Now, if you think that kula maskana d'shmaita, that means according to Rashi, even though the end of the sugya gives you multiple options, ribis ksisa shina kona maybe mashmos dvarim, all of them only work according to this sugya and not, or according to this version of sugya and not the other one. Okay, so now we have to go back and figure out. According to Rashi, according to Rabbeinu Gershom, it's not at all clear that there is a substantive difference between the two versions of the sugya. According to Rashi, it's critical that there be a substantive difference between the two, because without a substantive difference, you can't explain right. You can't explain why the end of the sugya should depend on it. Okay, so that's where I want to leave us. Right, that it's right that we have a number of push points where we can try and figure out what Rashi thinks is different. We have his explanation in the original in the original machloket. Then we have to figure out when since Rashi believes there are substantive differences in the outcome of Abai and Rava. So according to which lashon does Rashi explain the original machloket? Okay, then we have the question of whether we accept the Girs of Yachol as opposed to Chayav. I think that we should accept the Gersa we have again, right? You know, though that is in the face of the Gaon and the Bach, that we should have Yachol, and then we have to figure out, okay, the Yachol only exists in the second, right? In his commentary on the second sugya, right? I don't think does it explain it. Exists kind of, or does it exist in both? No, it's in both. Sorry, exists in both. So you have to figure out, right? What is the substantive difference in a Abayin Rava, according to Rashi, for both of these sugyot? Is it that in one of them, Rava, right, the issue is Lavanita Klasei, and the other one Lavanita Klasei never shows up? Is it in its definition of Mahani? Um, is it only right? Is it in both Abayin Rava, or only one of them changes? All right, that I think is right is the fundamental task. So what I would hope to do next week and I encourage everyone to spend as much time as you can. See if you can figure out, right, walk in figuring out what the substantive differences might be between the two versions of Rashi. Um, See if you can connect that to the way Rashi explains the Machlokas Abai and Rava in the initial version, and be aware that what we're going to try and do next week is to see if we can tie that into to the way Rashi explains the outcome of the sugya, where we will see that Rashi has a different girsa than our Gemara, a radically different girsa than our Gemara. So that also affects things. And I'll give you one more clue in that regard, which is that this Lishna Achrina doesn't exist in two manuscripts. In Munich and what Alliance University, right, Israeli University, hell, whatever it is, right, Xavier Chet, this Lishna Achrina is missing. Right, Rashi is doing something pretty right. So it can't, right? So Rashi has to Rashi reads the sugya in a way which is impossible if you're reading Munich. Unless you think that Rashi's changes in the Maskana are designed to make it compatible with this, and what Munich has is the version that Rashi rejects in the Maskana, and the version that we have is compatible with both versions, or one answer is compatible with one and one compatible with the other. But according to Rashi, what Rashi does is what Rashi's Girsa does, consciously or unconsciously, and that matters, is eliminate the possibility of a Maskana that's compatible with the first version and not the second. Okay, for those of you who think that there's no academic pilpul. Right? This is exactly right. This is good old cheshbon in a right in an academic mode. But I also think that it's just right. That I'm not. This is right. That this is entirely within Rashi. Right? I'm not making any effort to make claims about what the text is. I'm just making a claim to understand what Rashi is doing, and I hope that at least I'm demonstrating that what Rashi's that what Rashi's. I guess I hope that you'll tell me after next week whether I succeeded at all. But I felt better about it after this year. We'll see how I feel tomorrow night. Was that I think I hadn't sat down to show what I'm doing well enough. I was just sort of presenting it to show like that this is a method. The method yields things that lead to other things, and and just if it fails to solve it, that's just my inadequacy, right? But the method itself, I think, gets to where it needs to go. Okay, thank you very much, and I will, God willing, look forward to seeing all of you next week.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.